Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7th, 1941, 8:47 a.m. The smoke still climbed into the Hawaiian sky like funeral pyres reaching toward heaven. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, binoculars pressed against his face, watching the American Pacific Fleet burn in the harbor below. The metallic taste of cordite hung in the tropical air. Around him, his staff officers celebrated with restrained nods and tight-lipped smiles, the Japanese way. 8 battleships destroyed or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft obliterated before they could leave the ground. The backbone of American naval power in the Pacific broken in under 2 hours. What Nagumo didn't celebrate was what he couldn't see. Beneath the black petroleum smoke and the twisted steel, beneath the burning fuel oil spreading across the harbor like liquid fire, lay something the aerial photographs would never capture, the 3 American aircraft carriers that weren't there. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had been at sea, delivering aircraft to Wake and Midway, undergoing maintenance in San Diego. They had slipped through his fingers like water. In that moment, standing above the greatest tactical victory in Japanese naval history, Nagumo made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His staff officers urged him to launch a 3rd wave, to destroy the fuel depots, the submarine base, the repair facilities, everything that would allow America to strike back. But Nagumo, mindful of his missing carriers, mindful of the distance from home waters, ordered the fleet to withdraw. They had accomplished their mission. They had bought Japan 6 months, perhaps a year, to consolidate their conquests across the Pacific. What Nagumo didn't know, what no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy could have imagined, was that America didn't need 6 months. They didn't even need 6 weeks. The Japanese Empire in 1941 represented the culmination of decades of military expansion, industrial development, and nationalist fervor. Since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan had transformed itself from a feudal archipelago into a modern industrial power. They had defeated China in 1895, stunned the world by crushing the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, and spent the 1930s carving out an empire across mainland Asia. Their naval architects had designed the world's most powerful battleships. Their carrier pilots were the best-trained aviators on Earth, veterans of combat operations in China where they had honed their skills against real targets, real anti-aircraft fire, real death. The Imperial Japanese Navy studied American industrial capacity with the meticulousness of accountants examining a rival's ledgers. They knew America produced more steel. They understood the theoretical production capacity of American shipyards. But knowledge written in intelligence reports and understanding lived through experience are different things entirely. The Japanese High Command operated under a fundamental assumption that shaped every strategic calculation, that Americans were soft, that democracy made them weak, that a society built on individual comfort and material abundance couldn't summon the collective will necessary for total war. They had built their strategy on breaking American morale. One decisive blow, they believed, would force the Americans to negotiate. The Japanese didn't expect to invade California or occupy Washington. They expected to make the cost of war so high, so immediate, so devastating that America would accept a negotiated peace, recognizing Japanese dominance in Asia and the Pacific. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be that blow, the sword stroke that severed the head from the body. Instead, it was the alarm that woke a sleeping giant. Naval Shipyard, Pearl Harbor, December 8, 1941, the morning after the attack, while bodies were still being pulled from the wreckage and the wounded still screamed in makeshift hospitals. A different sound echoed across Pearl Harbor, the sound of welding torches cutting through twisted steel, the sound of crane engines lifting debris, the sound of shipyard workers wading through oil-slicked water to reach damaged vessels. The battleship California sat on the harbor bottom, her hull torn open by 2 torpedoes and a bomb. By every reasonable calculation, she should have been left for salvage after the war. Instead, within 72 hours, Navy engineers were already drawing up plans for her resurrection. The battleship West Virginia had taken 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, settling into the mud with over 100 men still trapped inside her hull. while rescue crews tapped messages to the dying men below, some of whom would survive for 16 days in airtight compartments before their air ran out. Other crews were already planning how to raise her, repair her, and return her to combat. The Japanese had sunk or damaged 18 ships at Pearl Harbor. Within 6 months, all but 3 of them would return to service. But battleships, despite their symbolic power, were yesterday's weapon. The future of naval warfare belonged to the aircraft carrier, and here the calculations seemed clearer. Japan had begun the war with 10 aircraft carriers to America's 7. Pearl Harbor had removed none of Japan's carriers while threatening America's position. The mathematics of carrier warfare looked favorable to Tokyo. They didn't account for the mathematics of American production. Bremerton Naval Shipyard, Washington, December 29, 1941. The carrier Saratoga limped into Puget Sound with a 9-meter hole torn in her port side. A Japanese submarine, I-6, had intercepted her 500 miles southwest of Hawaii, firing a spread of torpedoes. One had found its mark. The explosion killed 6 men and flooded 3 boiler rooms. Saratoga lost power, lost speed, and for agonizing hours drifted vulnerable in hostile waters, while her crew fought fires and sealed compartments. When she reached Bremerton, Japanese intelligence celebrated, one of America's 3 remaining carriers removed from the board. Historical precedent suggested repairs would take 6 months minimum. Major damage to a capital ship required complete dry docking, systematic inspection of every hull plate, replacement of entire compartments, recalibration of complex systems. The Imperial Navy's own experience suggested Saratoga wouldn't return to combat before summer. She was back at sea in 46 days. Not 46 days in dry dock with another month for sea trials and working up. 46 days from torpedo strike to operational deployment. The shipyard worked around the clock. 3 shifts of welders and electricians and pipe fitters who transformed night into day with the blue-white glare of arc welders. They didn't just patch the hole, they rebuilt entire compartments, upgraded systems, improved design flaws discovered through combat experience. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the intelligence report confirming Saratoga's return, he read it 3 times. Then he called for the file containing American industrial production figures. The numbers were there, printed in neat columns: steel output, electrical generation capacity, trained workforce population. But numbers on paper don't prepare you for the visceral reality of watching your enemy repair catastrophic damage faster than you can inflict it. Yamamoto had spent years in America as a naval attaché. He had driven across the country, seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the automobile factories of Detroit, the shipyards of Newport News. He had warned his superiors that war with America was war with an industrial colossus. After Saratoga's impossible repair, he made a note in his personal diary. "I fear we have awakened not a sleeping giant, but a factory with infinite production lines." Midway Atoll, June 4, 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the equation changed forever. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commanding the same carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, approached Midway Atoll with 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Intelligence had assured him the Americans could field at most 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Japanese reconnaissance had watched her limp into Pearl Harbor, photographed the massive hole torn in her hull by a 250-kilogram bomb. Damage assessment indicated 3 months minimum repair time. She appeared at Midway 72 hours later. Not fully repaired, not by peacetime standards. Shipyard workers were still aboard when she sailed, welding and hammering even as she sortied for battle. But she was operational. She could launch aircraft. She could fight. The sight of Yorktown launching strikes against his fleet shook Nagumo more than enemy bombs. He had seen the damage reports. He knew the extent of her injuries. Yet here she was, impossible, returning like a ghost ship from a grave that should have held her for months. When Hiryu's aircraft finally found and crippled Yorktown with torpedo strikes later that day, the Japanese pilots reported their victory with grim satisfaction. They had killed a ship that should have already been dead. But they had missed the larger lesson, the lesson that was even then being welded together in shipyards across America. By the end of that day at Midway, all 4 of Nagumo's carriers were gone. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned and sank within hours. Hiryu lasted until morning, her captain lashing himself to the bridge before she went down. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, the pilots who had trained for years, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, who represented an irreplaceable core of combat experience, fell into the Pacific with their burning carriers. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. America had lost Yorktown and had Saratoga and Wasp already preparing to fill the gap. The mathematics of carrier warfare had shifted, but not in the way Japanese naval planners had calculated. Kure Naval Base, Japan, July 1942. Admiral Osami Nagano sat in the headquarters of the combined fleet, reading reconnaissance reports with the focused intensity of a man watching his worldview collapse. Before him lay aerial photographs of American shipyards, Pearl Harbor, Mare Island, Puget Sound, and most disturbing of all, the massive facilities on the East Coast, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia, Newport News. The photographs showed construction that shouldn't be possible. Escort carriers rising from converted merchant hulls in weeks rather than months. Fleet carriers under construction simultaneously in multiple yards. Most unsettling were the modular construction techniques, entire sections of hull and superstructure fabricated separately, then assembled like children's blocks. The Americans had industrialized warship construction, turned it from a craft into a manufacturing process. Nagano ordered his intelligence staff to calculate American carrier production capacity. The numbers they returned made him request a second analysis, certain there had been an error. There wasn't. At current production rates, America would complete more aircraft carriers in 1943 than Japan had built in total since 1920. Not just escort carriers converted from merchant ships, but fleet carriers, Essex-class vessels displacing 27,000 tons, capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft each. The Essex-class carriers represented something more than just numbers. They embodied a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy. Japanese carriers were built by master craftsmen, each vessel slightly unique, constructed with attention to detail and traditional shipbuilding excellence. They were works of art and precision engineering. American carriers were products, standardized, modular, built with interchangeable parts and assembly line efficiency. They weren't better ships individually. Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japan's newest fleet carriers, were arguably superior designs. But the Americans didn't need better. They needed more. Nagano drafted a memorandum to the Naval General Staff. "We are not fighting a navy," he wrote. "We are fighting a factory, and we cannot sink a factory." The symbol of American abundance that haunted Japanese naval officers wasn't a weapon or a ship. It was something far more mundane: chocolate. When Japanese forces captured Wake Island in December 1941, they found the Marine garrison's supplies. Ammunition they expected, weapons they understood, but the sheer quantity of food supplies bewildered them. Each American serviceman was allocated rations that included not just rice or bread equivalents, but meat, vegetables, fruit, coffee, and candy. Chocolate bars were standard issue, not as a rare luxury, but as routine nutrition. Japanese soldiers received a daily rice ration supplemented by pickled vegetables and occasional fish. Meat was rare. Chocolate was almost mythical. The average Japanese infantryman consumed roughly 2,400 calories per day. The average American consumed 3,500 and considered it inadequate if it dropped below 3,200. This disparity in something as simple as food rations represented the broader chasm between the two industrial systems. Japan was a resource-poor nation that had spent decades learning to maximize limited inputs. They built their military strategy around the warrior spirit, compensating for material limitations. America was a continent-spanning nation glutted with resources, where the question was never whether they had enough, but how quickly they could convert abundance into war material. After Midway, when Japanese pilots were retrieved from life rafts by American vessels, their testimonies included a recurring observation. American sailors ate fresh eggs for breakfast, on a ship thousands of miles from home engaged in combat operations. Fresh eggs. To Japanese servicemen accustomed to the austere discipline of rice and pickles, this abundance seemed almost decadent, incomprehensible. It suggested an economy operating at such surplus capacity that even at war, even at the far reaches of supply lines, excess remained. The chocolate appeared again at Guadalcanal, where Japanese soldiers, starving in the jungle, overran American positions and found not just ammunition dumps, but pallets of food supplies. They found so much chocolate that some Japanese troops made themselves sick eating it. The Americans had simply left it behind when they repositioned, too common to bother retrieving. To Japanese commanders analyzing these battlefield recoveries, the chocolate represented something more terrifying than any weapon, an enemy for whom scarcity was irrelevant. Imperial Navy Ministry, Tokyo, November 1942. The carrier Hyo completed her trials in November 1942, joining the combined fleet as Japan's newest carrier. Her commissioning should have been celebrated. Instead, Admiral Nagano found himself calculating the timeline from keel laying to completion, 22 months, a respectable construction period by any peacetime standard. Meanwhile, intelligence reports confirmed that America had commissioned 4 escort carriers in November alone. 4 in 1 month. They weren't fleet carriers. Each displaced only 10,000 tons and carried fewer than 30 aircraft. But they were operational carriers that could hunt submarines, protect convoys, and provide air support for amphibious operations. 4 in 1 month, with another 6 scheduled for completion by year's end. The Japanese term shogunai, it cannot be helped, began appearing in naval staff meetings with increasing frequency. What response existed to an enemy who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them? What strategy countered an opponent whose production capacity grew stronger as the war progressed? Japan's carrier construction program represented the ceiling of their industrial capability. They had 5 fleet carriers in various stages of completion, carefully husbanded resources, prioritized essential systems. Expected completion dates stretched into 1944. Even working at maximum capacity, Japan could perhaps produce 3 carriers per year. America's 1943 construction schedule called for 15 fleet carriers, 30 escort carriers, and dozens of smaller vessels. Not a hopeful projection, a contracted reality with steel already laid down, workers already hired, assembly lines already operating. The implications tormented Japanese naval planners. Even if they achieved a favorable exchange ratio, even if they sank 2 American carriers for everyone they lost, the mathematics doomed them. America could afford to trade. Japan couldn't. Every carrier Japan lost was irreplaceable. Every carrier America lost was already being replaced. Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands, February 1944. The combined fleet's main anchorage at Truk had been called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Protected by reefs and fortified islands, it served as the hub of Japanese naval operations in the Central Pacific. On the morning of February 17, 1944, aircraft from 5 American carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, appeared over Truk in such numbers that Japanese observers initially thought they were counting incorrectly. 5 fleet carriers. 5. The Americans had lost Yorktown at Midway, yet here was another Yorktown. They had lost Lexington at Coral Sea, yet a new Lexington was operating in the Pacific. The names returned like ghosts, attached to new hulls built at impossible speed. The raid on Truk devastated Japanese air and naval forces at anchor. Over 50 ships sunk or damaged, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. But the psychological impact exceeded the material damage. The United States Navy had assembled a carrier task force larger than Japan's entire remaining carrier strength, and used it to attack the most heavily defended anchorage in the Central Pacific with casual confidence. Admiral Mineichi Koga, who had replaced Yamamoto after his death in 1943, reviewed the damage reports and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier: evacuate Truk. The fortress of the Pacific, the anchorage that had taken years and enormous resources to develop, was no longer safe. American carrier power had grown so overwhelming that nowhere in the Pacific beyond the range of land-based air support offered security. In his personal correspondence, Koga wrote a letter to his wife that captured the quiet desperation of Japan's naval command. We face an enemy whose ships multiply even as we sink them. I fear we are not at war with America. We are at war with arithmetic itself. The transformation in American carrier doctrine happened not just in quantity, but in operational philosophy. Early in the war, American carriers operated singly or in pairs, commanders husbanding their precious few carriers with cautious tactics. By 1944, carriers operated in task forces of 4, 5, 6 vessels, supported by dozens of escorts, refueled at sea by dedicated tanker groups. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, became the embodiment of industrial warfare at sea. At its peak, TF-58 comprised 15 fleet carriers and nearly 100 support vessels. It carried more aircraft than the entire Japanese carrier force at Pearl Harbor. It consumed more fuel in a day than Japan's entire navy had available for a week. When it moved, it didn't slip through the Pacific trying to avoid detection. It announced its presence by obliterating everything within 500 miles. Japanese commanders reading intelligence reports on TF-58's composition struggled to develop tactical responses. How do you ambush a force that doesn't care about being detected? How do you concentrate forces against an enemy who can simply absorb your attack and continue operations? The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of carrier warfare, the vulnerability of the carrier itself, by building so many carriers that losing one or two no longer mattered operationally. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan launched everything it had left. 9 carriers embarking 432 aircraft in a desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. American fighters, directed by radar from their carriers, massacred the Japanese strike forces in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese losses exceeded 300 aircraft. American losses, 29 aircraft, 3 ships damaged. The battle demonstrated not just American material superiority, but the cascading effects of industrial dominance. American pilots had trained longer because America could afford to keep them in training. They flew better aircraft because American factories built superior fighters. They were directed by better radar because American electronics production exceeded Japan's by orders of magnitude. They were supported by more carriers, more fuel, more ammunition, more of everything. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Linga Roads, September 1944. Admiral Soemu Toyoda sat at his desk reviewing the latest status reports and confronting a reality that numbers could no longer obscure. The combined fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a balanced naval force. He had battleships, Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever built, monuments to Japanese naval engineering. He had cruisers and destroyers. But carriers, the currency that mattered in Pacific naval warfare, were almost gone. Japan had 4 operational carriers remaining: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. 4. And even these were shadows of effective combat power. Trained pilots to fly from their decks were almost non-existent. The veterans who had launched from Akagi and Kaga at Pearl Harbor were dead, scattered across the floor of the Pacific from Coral Sea to Midway to the Philippine Sea. Their replacements had received perhaps a quarter of the training time, sent into combat with barely enough flight hours to take off and land safely, let alone engage American pilots who had trained for 2 years before seeing combat. The American carrier count, by Toyota's intelligence estimates, exceeded 30 fleet and light carriers, with another 40 escort carriers operating in support roles, 30 to 4, and every week brought reports of new American carriers completing trials, joining the fleet, adding to the crushing numerical superiority. Toyota drafted the operational plan for what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. It was less a plan for victory than a calculation of how to die meaningfully. The carriers, his last 4 carriers, would serve as decoys, bait to lure American carriers north while his battleships attempted to break through and destroy the American invasion fleet. The carriers weren't expected to survive. They weren't even expected to accomplish anything beyond drawing American attention. That his entire operational strategy revolved around sacrificing his carriers as disposable decoys represented the final inversion of carrier warfare doctrine. Carriers had become so precious to Japan that they were valuable only as sacrificial pieces. Meanwhile, America's carrier forces had become so numerous that losing several wouldn't even pause their offensive operations. October 25, 1944, Cape Engano, off Luzon. The decoy force under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sailed north with 4 carriers, embarking perhaps 70 aircraft total, less than a single American fleet carrier. Behind him, the American Third Fleet's TF-38 approached with 17 carriers embarking over 1,000 aircraft. Ozawa's mission was to be seen, to be chased, to die, drawing American power away from the landing beaches at Leyte. He succeeded brilliantly at all 3. American search planes found his force and reported back. Admiral William Halsey, commanding Third Fleet, took the bait and turned his entire force north to engage. The battle, such as it was, unfolded as a technological mismatch so severe it barely qualified as combat. American aircraft swarmed over Ozawa's carriers in waves that never seemed to end. Chitose sank first, overwhelmed by torpedo and bomb hits. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, absorbed 7 torpedoes and 9 bombs before capsizing. Zuiho and Chiyoda followed her down within hours. Ozawa survived, pulled from the water by a destroyer. In his after-action report, he described watching American aircraft circle overhead in holding patterns, waiting their turn to attack because so many planes were striking his carriers that they had to queue. "They attacked us," he wrote, "as a factory processes material on an assembly line, methodically, without haste, certain of the outcome." Japan had entered the war with 10 carriers. They had built or converted another 15 during the conflict. All 25 were now sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again conduct carrier operations. America had begun the war with 7 carriers. By October 1944, they had commissioned more than 80. The speed of American carrier construction became its own form of psychological warfare. Japanese commanders didn't just face defeat, they faced the visible proof that their enemy operated at a level of industrial capacity beyond anything in their experience. When the Essex-class carrier USS Bunker Hill was severely damaged by kamikazes in May 1945, hit by 2 suicide aircraft that killed 396 men and nearly gutted the ship, Japanese intelligence predicted she would be out of the war. She was under repair for weeks, not months, and ready to return to combat by war's end. The light carrier USS Franklin suffered even worse damage in March 1945. Multiple bomb hits ignited fires that detonated ammunition and armed aircraft. More than 800 men died. The carrier's flight deck buckled from explosions. Smoke billowed so thick that nearby ships thought she'd been destroyed. Yet her crew kept her afloat, and she returned to New York under her own power. Japanese propagandists claimed she'd been sunk. American newspapers published photographs of her entering harbor, grievously wounded but alive, and already being scheduled for repair. These ships became symbols in themselves, not because they were repaired, though that was remarkable enough, but because their repair didn't matter strategically. America had so many carriers that Franklin and Bunker Hill could be removed from combat for repairs without affecting operations. The fleet continued operating at full strength because new carriers arrived faster than old ones were damaged. Naval Ministry, Tokyo, April 1945. Admiral Nagano sat in his office reviewing the final accounting. The combined fleet no longer existed as an operational entity. Japan's remaining capital ships were destroyed, damaged beyond repair, or unable to put to sea for lack of fuel. The carriers were all gone, everyone sunk or scrapped for parts. Before him lay intelligence photographs of American shipyards. Even now, with victory certain and the war effectively won, American yards continued launching carriers. Valley Forge, Boxer, Leyte, Kearsarge, Essex-class carriers completing their trials for a war that would be over before they reached the Pacific. America wasn't just winning, They were demonstrating production capacity that exceeded even wartime necessity. Nagano had opposed the war from the beginning, arguing that Japan lacked the industrial foundation for a prolonged conflict with America. He had been overruled by officers who believed spirit could overcome material, that the warrior code would prove superior to American softness. Now, with Japan's cities burning under B-29 raids, with the home islands under blockade, with defeat inevitable, he wrote his final assessment. "We calculated American production capacity," his report stated. "We saw the numbers representing their steel output, their manufacturing capability, their shipyard potential. We believed we understood what those numbers meant. We were wrong. Numbers written in intelligence reports are abstractions. We did not understand, could not have understood, what it meant to face an enemy for whom industrial capacity was effectively unlimited. We fought bravely. Our ships were well designed. Our sailors were courageous. But we brought swords to battle with a factory, and no amount of courage can defeat industrial mathematics." The report contained a footnote that almost no one read, buried in technical appendices. It noted that America had produced 24 Essex-class fleet carriers during the war. Each displaced 27,000 tons and required approximately 3.2 million man-hours to construct. Japanese intelligence estimated that building a single carrier equivalent to the Essex class would have consumed Japan's entire naval shipyard capacity for 4 months. America had built 24, and those were just the fleet carriers. The total, including escort carriers and light carriers, exceeded 140 vessels. August 15, 1945, Imperial Palace, Tokyo, Emperor. Hirohito's recorded surrender broadcast crackled across Japan through radio sets in homes, factories, and military bases. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," his carefully euphemistic statement began. Among the naval officers listening was Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had served as Yamamoto's chief of staff. Ugaki kept a detailed diary throughout the war. His final entry before he flew his own suicide mission addressed the question of why Japan had lost. He listed tactical mistakes: the failure to strike the fuel depots at Pearl Harbor, the decision to split forces at Midway, the attrition of carrier pilots that couldn't be replaced. But his final paragraph returned to a simpler explanation. "We calculated how long it would take them to build a carrier. We were wrong by 2 years. Every calculation that followed from that initial error compounded our mistake. We fought well, we fought bravely, but we fought against an enemy who turned war into industry, and industry into ships that multiplied faster than we could sink them. What can honor do against a factory that never sleeps?" In the end, what Japanese admirals said when they realized America rebuilt carriers in weeks rather than months wasn't captured in a single dramatic quote. It was expressed through thousands of increasingly desperate reports, through operational plans that shifted from victory to survival, through strategic assessments that evolved from confident to concerned to quietly desperate. But perhaps Admiral Nagano's comment to his staff in late 1944 captured it best. An aide had brought him the latest production figures showing America on pace to commission 8 carriers in a single month, more than Japan had built in the entire year. Nagano studied the report for several minutes, then set it down on his desk. "We are watching," he said, "a demonstration of what happens when industrial democracy focuses its full attention on warfare. We studied their factories before the war. We saw the automobile plants, the steel mills, the assembly lines. We understood intellectually what they represented, but understanding intellectually that Henry Ford's factories could produce 5,000 trucks per week is different from watching those trucks land on Pacific beaches. Understanding abstractly that America produces 50 million tons of steel annually is different from counting the carriers built from that steel." He paused, looking out at the harbor where Japan's surviving warships sat idle for lack of fuel. "We thought the warrior spirit would overcome material advantage. We believed the Americans were soft, that they lacked the will for sacrifice. We were wrong on every count. They sacrificed enormously, not through deprivation but through transformation. They turned their entire continental economy into a weapon. And we learned, too late, that you cannot torpedo a factory. You cannot bomb an assembly line that stretches from California to New York. You cannot sink a nation whose production capacity exceeds your entire economy. 79 years later, in climate-controlled archives and museums, the artifacts of that industrial triumph rest behind glass. The Essex-class carrier USS Intrepid sits permanently moored in New York, transformed into a museum. School groups walk her decks, touching the same steel that sailors crewed when the ship was commissioned in 1943. The construction photographs show her taking shape in Newport News, keel laid in December 1941, launched in April 1943, commissioned in August, 20 months from start to combat deployment. Displayed near the gangway is something smaller, less martial, but perhaps more symbolic. A ship's stores requisition from December 1943, listing supplies brought aboard before deployment. Ammunition and fuel oil appear in expected quantities, but so does coffee, 80,000 pounds of it. Chocolate bars, 45,000 units. Fresh fruit, refrigerated storage for 15,000 pounds. Not for a year at sea, but for a 3-month deployment, after which the ship would be resupplied. Tour guides rarely mention this requisition. Visitors photograph the aircraft and the big guns, the dramatic machinery of warfare. But that chocolate ration, buried in administrative records, represents something more profound than any weapon. It represents the casual abundance of an economy so vast that even at war, even while building more carriers in 1 year than most nations built in their entire history, it could still provide chocolate to sailors as routine supply. Japanese admirals calculated tonnage and range and aircraft capacity. They evaluated armor thickness and horsepower and torpedo loads, all the metrics of naval warfare. What they couldn't calculate, couldn't prepare for, couldn't counter through any tactical brilliance, was fighting an enemy for whom scarcity was a concept that belonged to someone else's war. The carriers rose from American shipyards like crops from abundant fields, predictable, inexorable, overwhelming not through any individual superiority, but through sheer accumulated mass. And Japan, having awakened that factory with their dawn attack on a peaceful Sunday morning, discovered that some forces, once stirred, cannot be resisted by courage alone. The lesson echoes across decades. Industrial capacity, mobilized and focused, transforms conflict from a contest of wills into a contest of mathematics. And mathematics, unlike honor, cannot be defeated by dying bravely. In the waters off Kapingano, where Zuikaku took her final dive, the ocean floor holds the physical remains of Japan's carrier force. In the shipyards of America, now building container ships and cruise vessels, the slipways that launched 100 carriers in 4 years have moved on to peacetime production. The ships are gone. The generation that built and sailed them is fading. But the truth they demonstrated remains, carved not in monuments, but in the archaeological record of production, that when democracy decides to wage industrial war, it fights not with soldiers alone, but with the accumulated weight of a free economy's full capacity. And that weight, once committed, was something Japan never calculated how to resist.